as seasoned as you are as an author, do you find yourself still battling that narrative that says,
Yes.
yeah,
I actually have a name for them. I call them the harpies.
uh-huh.
Remember in the Greek tragedies, there would always be a harpy dressed in black. You couldn't see their face, and they'd run across the stage and they'd say, "That's a bad person, be wary of that person."
Welcome to the Bookish Introverts Podcast. Join host Amazon bestselling author Brett Nelson and avid reader Melanie Dyer as they dive in to review books they've read, then chat with the amazing authors behind them. Quiet minds, big bookshelves. You don't want to miss it.
Hey everyone, it's Brett, and we're back to continue our Baker Publishing Author Summer event. Today is episode 4, and we have talked with several great authors from Baker Publishing. So if you haven't listened to those, you may want to go back and check those out. Today, we have got Miss Jane Kirkpatrick on the podcast. She's a historical fiction author. So Jane, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, nice to be here. Thank you, Brett.
You're welcome. Nice to have you. So before we get started, I'm going to do just a little quick bio on you. You've been writing for a while, so anybody that reads Christian fiction probably already knows who you are, but we'll go ahead and just tell a little bit about you. So Jane Kirkpatrick is a New York Times bestselling and award-winning author of over 40 books and numerous essays for over 50 publications throughout the U.S. She received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Romantic Times in 2012. The Caldera Achievement Award from the Nature of Words in 2006, and the Distinguished Northwest Writer Award in 2005 from the Willamette Writers Association. Her works have sold over 2 million copies. Jane, can you believe you have sold 2 million books? Is that just unreal to you?
Very unreal, yes.
That is just...
Especially since I started so old. My first book wasn't published until the day before I turned 45. So,
Really?
I'm envious of all of those younger writers like you who sort of knew what their passion was early on. So,
yeah, and I wish I had started earlier too. I guess everybody does, but yeah, that's just, wow, that's amazing. You've won prestigious literary awards such as the Wrangler, the National Cowboy Museum. I guess that's an award the National Cowboy Museum gives out.
Yep. Correct. Yes.
Okay.
They give one a year, and they do it for nonfiction and illustrations and film, and it's a wonderful event. If you're anywhere near Oklahoma City,
I used to live in Norman.
Well, there you go. So yeah, they do it annually, and they have a fabulous museum there. I was unaware of that award until the novel I wrote won it. So that was really pretty amazing.
So which novel was that?
It was called A Sweetness to the Soul.
Okay.
And it was my very first novel, my very first foray into fiction. And so it was very humbling to have that recognition.
Wow.
So, yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah. A Willa Literary Award. Tell us a little bit about that one.
So there's an organization called Women Writing the West, which was formed about 25 years ago now. I was a founding member of that. And about 5 years into our organization, which supports the stories about girls and women in the West, both contemporary and fiction and poetry and nonfiction. And we created the Willa Literary Award, which is given in, I think it's now 8 categories, again, to help promote stories of the American West that celebrate girls and women. Because a lot of the Western stories were really focused on men. And when I was doing research, I would frequently come across a sentence like, John Jones and his sons William and James and his wife and 2 daughters founded the city of whatever, and the women wouldn't even be named. And so that was part of what piqued my passion to tell stories of historical women that might otherwise be lost.
Yeah, we don't want those lost to history for sure.
No.
The Will Rogers Medallion, is that based out of Oklahoma City? Because a lot of things in Oklahoma City are sort of centered around Will Rogers, the big international airport.
Yes, and he actually, the Medallion Awards for many years were in Dallas-Fort Worth. And this last fall, I was given this great honor of a Lifetime Achievement Award, but it's the last time they were doing it in Fort Worth, and it's now moving to Oklahoma City.
Oh,
So it
okay.
will be, and everything will be in Oklahoma City, but he's everywhere. I mean, he was just really quite a remarkable human being and writer and, commentator and just a really amazing man. So they too have an awards in a number of different categories that they
Mm.
give for writers. So
And
yeah,
it's all
screenplays
like
and
historical cowboy
well,
based, or
it's a Western. I would say Western, the Western
okay.
experience. So
Oh,
it,
okay.
it will have something related to either the Western expansion or ranching, um, the interaction between Anglo and Native American experiences. Yeah. So, and it's children's books, but it's basically celebrating those qualities of the West of compassion and caring and reverence for the land and reverence for each other. So yeah,
Hmm.
it's a pretty it's a pretty cool and quite diverse actually winners in that organization for the
Yeah.
medallion awards. Yeah.
When did he die? Do you know? Right off the top
Oh,
of your head?
I should have. I think it was like in the 50s.
Oh, okay.
I think it might not
Okay.
have been. It might have been earlier than that. I think of him as, he was the only Native American to ever MC the Academy Awards, and
Oh.
he did a lot of his. He traveled all over the world. He was just, we were my husband a couple of years and we were vacationing in Mexico, and at the restaurant they had these little placemats and they had quotes from different people, and there was a quote in there from Will Rogers. It was
Oh,
just so
wow.
funny. Yeah, so he's very, very universal, man. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but I'm not sure when he did pass away.
His
Yeah.
marketing people did a good job because he's everywhere.
Yes,
He's
they did.
everywhere.
Yeah, he's everywhere.
Yeah, and of course the Carol Awards. Most of us that are read Carol
Yes.
Christian fiction recognize the Carol
Right.
Awards. So you've won a Carol Award. You speak internationally on writing and the power of stories. So tell us a little bit about your speaking engagements.
So I was privileged to be invited to the European Council of International Schools. They're usually the children of, you know, CEOs, missionaries, and the schools all taught in English, and they have a conference every year from all over Europe. And so twice I've been asked to speak. Once was in Nice, France, once in Sorrento, Italy, and basically it's encouraging teachers and helping them feel empowered about the importance of their role in
Yeah.
making a difference in the lives of kids, and the power of stories. And I think
Hmm.
for particularly for children whose many of the children are not necessarily with their parents are somewhere else and they're enrolled in these schools, to have that sense of family and create that sense within that school community, and how powerful and important that is for these kids. So that was, I think that stories are you know, they're what other people read about us first, is our
Yes.
stories.
Hmm.
And so that can really make a difference in
Yeah.
how that happens. So yeah, so
Yeah.
that was my work. And I do a lot of speaking for fundraising events, kind of inspirational speaking, but encouraging people to think about their legacies and what do they want their life to say.
Hmm.
And I because my background is in mental health, actually, before I started writing, that I came across this great quote from the founder of the psychiatric center in Kansas, and he said, "What people don't realize is that people that uh, generosity is the single most important feature of a mentally healthy person. That
Hmm.
mentally ill, generous people are rarely mentally ill. That
Oh,
generosity is one of those qualities. And so I try to encourage people to say, hey, give to this school, give to this library, give to this foundation, because it'll be good for your mental health.
yeah.
So
Giving makes you happier.
It does.
Yeah,
Exactly. Exactly.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I kind of want to piggytail off that because as you mentioned, you prior to your writing career, you worked with the Native American families of the Warm Springs Indian Reservation in Central Oregon as a mental
Right.
health. So, uh, tell us a little bit about that. Exactly, how did you help them?
Well, I prior to that, my experience had been working with families with disabilities, and then I became the director of a mental health clinic that had
Hmm.
quite a range of services. And then my husband and I did this crazy thing, and we left suburbia and moved to what I called Rattlesnake and Rock Ranch, and it was more expensive than we thought, so I had to get a job. And
Uh,
this wonderful opportunity came to help establish a program called Early Intervention. And so I worked with the families of children who were 5 and under, and most of them had some kind of disability. They were perhaps they've been born really prematurely. There might have been some fetal alcohol syndrome kids, but it was generally working with young families about their most precious, their most precious part of their life, which was their children. And
yeah.
so for 17 years, I was allowed into their lives, and I hope I made a difference for them in identifying their child's strengths and being supportive parents. One of the things we did that was somewhat unique, that it's sort of stories, that the reservation had its own uh, radio station, and so we would get people whose voices were familiar, like the doctor at the clinic and the police chief, for example. And I would provide children's books for them to read, and they would read that over the air. And then I had questions that I created for families to talk about at home. And we got so many requests for those programs to be repeated, and
Mm,
especially by the bus drivers, because the bus trips were long. They might have been an hour for the kids to be picked up before they got to school. And the bus drivers said, when those stories are on and people are reading them, the kids quiet down. Even if they've heard the story 10 times, it didn't matter. They said, play that every morning, from 5 to 7. We want stories. And
yeah.
I just think that was the evidence of how stories link us, regardless of the cultures.
Yes, and that's not something you can say about video games. Kids these
No.
days, they're so immersed in video
Yeah.
games and TV games, and stuff like that. And I used to love the Nintendo back
Yeah.
when I was younger, so I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but nothing sticks with you like a good
Like a
story,
story.
like
You're
a good
right.
story.
Absolutely.
Yeah, they're
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
important.
Yeah.
Um, so tell me a little bit about you're a New York Times bestselling author, and so that is like a huge, like every author that writes a book would love to be included in the New York Times bestseller list. Uh, when did that happen? Was it just like a particular book, or was it several books? Kind of tell us a little bit about that.
So in some ways, I feel a little bit like I cheated, because it was my story was part of a collection called The Log Cabin Christmas, and that's the piece that became the bestseller at the New York
Oh,
Times.
okay.
And it was a collection of just a variety of writers. I think there were 9 of us
Hmm.
who wrote a story about that had a Christmas theme of some kind, and that it did really well. It created a lot of buzz about, and they were all kind of historical Western log cabin ish in its
Yeah.
nature. So yeah, so that was pretty cool to have that happen and take off.
Now, one of the previous authors that I talked to mentioned being in an anthology like that, and I'm wondering if they were in the same one. I've talked to so many, I can't remember which. I can't remember if it was Anne Gabhart or Liz Johnson. Do either one of those sound familiar?
No, no, not for that one. But
Not
I
for
know
that one.
both of
Okay.
those authors. Yeah, I know both of them. Yeah, and Liz or Anne and I were in another one called "Sincerely Yours." It was a four author book that actually was published by Baker a
Oh,
number of
okay.
years ago. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's one of them. And Liz Johnson, before she became a wonderful writer, was a publicist for Baker, and
Oh.
and I had the privilege of her sort of escorting me around one time to an event back in, oh gosh, I think it was somewhere in Missouri, and the interviewer got really taken up with, I had a pair of earrings that were fabric made by a woman on the Warm Springs Reservation. They were little baskets. And we ended up spending almost the whole time talking about my earrings
Oh,
instead of the
wow.
book. But it's the way. But maybe people will remember that because there were those interesting fabric earrings. So
Oh,
yeah.
okay. Yeah. Yeah. She was the one we talked to last week. And so
Oh yes,
she
she's just a
was just
delight.
yeah,
Yeah,
she was so fun to
yeah,
talk with. Although
yeah,
I knew she had worked in publishing previously, but she didn't mention that it had been with Baker. So that's pretty
yeah,
cool.
yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
it was with Baker. I'm pretty sure it was with Baker. It might have been with Multnomah or Waterbrook because those are my other publishers. So yeah,
Oh, so
but that's how I met her.
how
Yeah.
many do you have?
So my 41st book is coming out. So the first almost 20 or so were with Multnomah, and then Multnomah got purchased by Waterbrook, which is now part of Penguin Random House. And
Yeah.
then about in 2010 is when I had the delight of publishing with Baker and Revell. So
Oh,
the
okay.
last umpteen books have been with them, which has
Oh,
been
okay.
good.
So you've been with them
Yeah,
for a while.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
So there's a little bit of a journey involved with becoming an author. What made you decide to to delve into writing your first novel, and how did that happen? Because that's a pretty daunting thing to do for the first time.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. So I always did some writing when I was younger, but they were poems. I called them wretched little poems. They would
Ah,
be just, anyway.
yeah.
And I had wonderful teachers who would compliment me on my writing. And when I was the director of a mental health program, of course, I had to write a lot of letters that were administratively and, describing concerns or whatever with budget, county commissioners, state people. And I would get letters back or calls from people who'd say, no one's ever put it in those words. We need to talk about what we can do to change that problem.
Yeah.
So I knew that words had power, but I didn't journal. I didn't really expect anybody. I wasn't planning to write. And then my husband and I made this decision to move to this very remote piece of property and start a different life. And once we got electricity, I started writing letters to people because everyone thought we were crazy, of course. And so I would write letters, and a friend of ours wrote back and said, "When we get your letters, we don't read them right away. We wait until after supper. We turn off the TV and we read them out loud because they're like a chapter in a book."
Wow.
And so I thought, well, maybe I could write about this journey, this decision that we had to leave suburbia and try this new thing that we were trying to do, and following our heart, about just following your heart, even when people tell you you're crazy. What
Yeah.
you want to adopt a child and you're old. I mean, what's wrong with you? Those sorts of things. So that became my first book, which was called Homestead.
Now, what year was that?
That came out in 1991.
1991. Okay,
So
the year I
yeah,
graduated high school.
there you go. So, and that came out the day before I turned 45. So that was that
Wow.
one. And before we left our life in suburbia, I had been really praying about what would I do there, because my husband really wanted to do this. His son had been killed the year before, and I think he was very young when he died. And I think my husband was really felt that he needed to live as fully as he could, that life was short. And
Yes.
and so he wanted to do this homesteading thing, see if we could make it as ranchers.
Mhm.
And so I kept thinking, well, what would I do there? I mean, my skills were as a mental health director and disabilities and all this sort of stuff. And this wonderful word came to me, which was totally out of nowhere, and it was right. So I thought, well, right. And so I took a class at the local community college in creative writing and was blessed with an instructor, Bob Welch. I don't know if you know him. He doesn't write
Mm-mm.
fiction, but he writes wonderful books about life and living. and humor. Anyway, he suggested that some of my essays that I'd written could get published. And I was able to get them published. And so that was really very affirming before we made this decision. So I wrote the book Homestead, and it was published by Word, and it did very well. It was one of their book picks for their book club at the time. Now they're part of Thomas Nelson, I think. And then I thought, well, I've done my writing. Well, then there was a story that wouldn't let me go, and it was based on another couple who, in the 150 years earlier, had followed their heart when everybody kind of thought they were crazy. And I just thought somebody should tell this story. And my husband said, and it couldn't be me because I'd never written fiction, and it couldn't be me because it wasn't my family. And my husband said, if you think it's a great story, you should just write it down. And if people don't like your version, they can write their own version.
Yeah, because it is true. As an author myself, when something grabs hold of you, you can't let it go until you get it on paper.
And that is one of my best advice to young writers: is pay attention to the story that won't let you go.
Yes.
And don't worry about the market. You never know. And so I thought, well, when would I write this? Because we had a ranch. I was commuting 2.5 hours to the reservation. And I thought, well, all I had been doing between 5 and 7 in the morning was sleeping. So I thought I could maybe write between 5 and 7. And so I set the alarm at 4. And my commitment wasn't for a number of words or anything, but just to show up by 5 o'clock. And then the next day after I made that decision, we went to a historical society meeting, and a man I did not know asked me what I did. And I said, I'm a writer, which was the first time I said it without disclaimers.
Yeah.
And he said, what are you working on? And I said, oh, I'm writing the story of Jane and Joseph Shearer and their life with the Wasco, Warm Springs, and Paiute people. And I had not yet written one sentence, but I figured I'd done the hardest work because I'd made that commitment. And he said, well, you should meet my cousin because she owns the property that their original homestead was on. And I think she'd let you walk there. And she did. Wow. And there's this wonderful quote from Van Gerritse, the lyrical poet, who said that what people don't realize is once you make a commitment to something, then providence moves and things begin to happen that you otherwise never could have imagined. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the other advice, listen to that story and then commit to it. Commit some part of it, a certain number of words or a goal you set yourself, but make that commitment because things will happen that you never could have imagined.
Exactly. Things just have a way of just shaping up and yeah. And sometimes you have to work against that little voice in your head that says, oh, you're not good enough. This is not any good. You're never gonna, you have to work against that. Like as seasoned as you are as an author, do you find yourself still battling that narrative that says,
yes,
yeah,
I actually have a name for them. I call them the harpies. Remember in the Greek tragedies, there would always be a harpy dressed in black. You couldn't see their face and they'd run across the stage and they'd say, that's a bad person, be wary of that person.
Yeah.
And so I call them the harpies, and I actually have done some workshops about putting duct tape on the harpies. And I have to do it I have to go back over that material every book because it just feels like, that at some point I'll write something and this voice says, what you just wrote, no one will give up cleaning their toilets to read. They're going to be more busy doing something else.
Yeah.
And I have to remind myself that it's not my job to write the great American novel. It's my job to show up and to assume the position of a writer and to tell the story I've been given the best way I know how. And to trust that I'm not alone in the telling, that I'm not there by myself.
Yeah.
So, those voices can be pretty loud, as you know. Maybe
very much. Yeah. And it makes me it makes me feel so much better to know that even somebody like you still fights that because those voices can be pretty brutal.
Pretty brutal is right. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a great term for it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. I do kind of want to touch on you write historical fiction. Have you always written historical fiction? Have you ever dabbled in contemporary?
I did do one contemporary novel at the request of the publisher, because I used to, when I would do my presentations, I would, one of the things I would frequently say is, it isn't my job to get Oprah to know my name,
Mhm.
and I said, someday I'm going to write a book about a writer who's trying to get Oprah to know her name and all the ridiculous things she'd be willing to do to get to be known. Well,
Yeah.
one of my publishers said, we'd like you to write that book. And I'm like, oh,
Huh.
that was just like, that was just me blabbing or whatever. And then, no, no,
Yeah.
no, we want you to write it. So I wrote it and they didn't like it. They said, no, it's just not. And I thought, well, I could have told you that because I like history as the spine. Well, then a couple of
Yeah.
years later, an editor who had liked it, and he went with a different publisher. And so we did publish it. Tyndale published it it's called Barcelona Calling.
Mhm.
And it's funny, and people who have read it, but they all say, if they've read my other work, they all say, I can't believe you wrote that book. It's like a totally different sort of style. And it is, because I'm really, that my heart belongs to the stories of
Mm.
history.
Yeah.
And so this was my effort at a contemporary, and I've done nonfiction, devotionals and
Oh,
grief
okay.
related books. But the only fiction I've tried that's contemporary has been that book, and
Okay.
it's still in print. It's still,
Yeah.
but it hasn't. I haven't found the audience that my historical novels found.
Yeah,
So
and I think when it comes to readers, when they kind of get used to you writing a certain
mhm.
thing, that's really kind of all they want from you. So
Mhm.
so I can see how your diehard historical fiction fans would be
Yeah.
like, not interested in that contemporary stuff.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
yeah, do you still write nonfiction, or are you pretty much on fiction now?
Pretty much fiction. I do a monthly newsletter that's nonfiction
Okay.
that has a pretty good following, and there a lot of people will say that's it has a really good opening rate, like an
Mm.
80%,
Oh,
and
that's pretty good. Yeah.
and partly because it is very personal. I talk about my husband and my dog, and talk about writing, and talk about I always um, celebrate a book that I've read or a book that I'm reading, and then just talk about some of the challenges of living that I hope is inspirational, giving people tools for
Yeah.
everyday life. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Tell us a little bit about. I find it so fascinating. I'm just now getting into reading historical fiction. I've always thought I didn't like it, but the more I've been reading it, I really enjoy it. So, of course, the times that you historical fiction writers write in, you weren't alive during that time, because I think the book that we're talking about today, I think it took place in the 1800s. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
So
Late
you weren't
1800s. Yeah.
alive during that time. How do you get your finger onto the pulse of that time period that you weren't even there for?
Well, that's the fun research part.
Okay.
So over the last umpteen years that I've been doing this, I spent a lot of time in the basements of courthouses looking at documents. I've read. I go to little historical societies and read diaries of everyday lives that people have
Oh,
donated. So if you're wondering what to do with your mother's letters,
yeah.
that she wrote, during the war or whatever, consider donating them to the local library because they usually have collections like that.
Yeah.
So, and now, of course, with the internet, there's much greater access. But when I was
Hmm.
first writing, it was a lot of what I would call go there. Go to that place and walk where that person walked and see what
Yeah.
they might have seen and imagine what they might have seen. Um, one of the things that readers will give you that's different for contemporary. Like in a contemporary novel, if I said, the character walked into a Starbucks. Well, lots of people have had experiences with Starbucks, so their own experience gets brought in, and they may or
Yes.
may not agree with your character's experience. But in
Yes.
a historical, if I say, the character went into Toll's mercantile, well,
Hmm.
the reader will accept that I have created, hopefully, if I've done a good job, that I've created a real world that they can enter into with me, because I've
Yeah.
never been at Toll's store, but
Yeah.
in 1888, this is what they had. And I use a lot of photographs, historical photographs, to give me a sense of that. And there'll be some tiny little thing like, I just the other day, I was looking at a picture of that Toll's store where my character actually would have shopped.
Uh-huh.
And I had not seen that picture before. And you can blow it up. And on the side was like, are those oars? Are those canoe oars that they were selling? No, they were brooms, and they had,
Brooms.
certain kind of brooms that were for sale.
Yeah.
And then you could see the strings, the roll of strings, because that's how they wrapped up packages at that time. So, um, I think I think what is engaging as a historical novel are those details, but not too many. And so
Ah.
when I'm doing my draft, I have a lot of details, because I want to remember that, and I'll say to myself, well, they were on this ship and I just learned who the captain of that ship is. And the reader will want to know that. But when
Yeah.
I get to doing the edits, I realize, no, that's just too much information.
Yeah.
Unless that captain of the ship is going to later shoot somebody that matters,
Yeah. And you
the
have to
reader
kind
doesn't
of,
need it.
yeah, and you have to kind of navigate that whole just enough information into information dump.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was with this book, one of the really lovely reviews was within Library Journal, and the comment was made that there were no, she said, anachronistic episodes in the book. And my
Yeah.
editor said, that's a really great compliment, that you weren't using something from the 21st century that
Yes.
showed up that would take people out of the story. And so
Yes.
that's what we're trying to do, is keep them there in the 1880s, and not out here going, oh, I wonder if they would have had that then. You don't want that. You want them to
Yeah.
feel, this is my world and I can feel safe in that world. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's funny. Like I said, I'm new to historical fiction reading, and so I had read one of Anne Gabhart's prior books called These Healing Hills, and she had mentioned, and I think that one took place in the 1800s too. And while I was reading, I ran across one of the characters drank a Coke. I was like, "What? Cokes in the 1800s?" So I was Googling it, and sure enough, those were. I
Sure
was like,
enough.
I
Yeah.
had no idea
Yeah.
Cokes were a thing in 1800s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's a great example, because I think readers like learning that,
Uh-huh.
oh, they had Coke back then. And
Yeah.
at the same time, it's like it was enough of a, something distinguished it that you wanted to go look it up. And so it's
Yeah,
that
yeah. And I
balance. It's
totally
like,
trusted her. I just wanted to see it for
yeah,
myself.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So do you ever and Anne and I actually talked a little bit about this too, especially when it comes to historical fiction. Um do you ever feel like you have to tiptoe around the sensitivities of modern day readers? Because in a lot of times in reviews, I read, where readers were offended by something, because the woman was depicted as too needy or too reliant on a man, or, blah, blah, blah,
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
Do you feel like you have to tiptoe around reader sensitivities, or do you just do what you have to do and just,
I feel like my first responsibility is to the character,
Mhm.
and to being authentic with that character,
Yeah,
and then the next responsibility is, to the reader, or their sensibilities. But I um, sometimes I will ask myself, what is it that you're not saying to me as an author? What am I
yes,
avoiding? And that
yes,
usually gives me a sense of, okay, you're avoiding it because of X, Y, or Z. But one of the places where that can show up is in language.
Mhm.
And so there are words, for example, that within the Native American community, there are names on maps. In Central Oregon, there was a place called Squaw Mountain. And
Mhm.
squaw was a term that was used largely by white male trappers to describe Indian women. And it was a derogatory term. And
Oh, okay.
so, but there it was, it's on maps, it's authentic, all that. And so part of my journey as a writer has been, but if I can find a way to talk about, this trapper who's being dismissive of this Indian woman without using a word that is offensive, then it makes more work for me. But I think that's part of my job too. Why would I repeat
Mm.
something that was offensive that
Mhm.
maybe it wasn't then, but or at least that white trapper didn't know it was offensive, but the
Yes.
native people have taught me that's an offensive word, and so why
Mm.
would I use that if I
Right.
don't have to? But it means
Yeah.
a little more work,
Mhm.
and that's okay with me. I think it's this is sort of a leap, but it's the same reason why I don't do gynecological things having to do with sexual relationships in any of my books. You're
Mhm.
not going to
Yeah.
find that. And my brother at one point read one of my books and he said, your characters, you'd sell more books if your characters had sex. And I said, they do have sex. They just don't have it where you can see it.
Exactly.
And
And as a
so,
reader, that's how I want it. That
yeah,
belongs behind
yes,
closed doors.
exactly.
Nobody needs to hear about it, read about it, or talk about
Yes,
it.
yes.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
always said that I have an agreement with my characters when I started writing that I would not reveal any of their personal sexual idiosyncrasies, and then they agreed never to reveal any of mine. And so
Exactly.
that's our agreement. But I think that's another place where, or even profanities, that
Oh, yeah.
it takes more work to create the atmosphere of someone who is so angry or so upset or so whatever that they would use a profanity without using it. And that I think that's part of a
Yes.
writer's responsibility to do that work so that
Yes.
we're not offending a reader as they're going along.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and especially in Christian fiction, but
yeah, you just
but
don't want that.
yeah, but I really wish more, because I love Christian fiction, but I still read some secular fiction, especially
Sure.
authors that
Yeah.
I've marked as safe because, like you just said, I hate reading books that are full of sexual stuff. I hate reading books that are just full of profanity. Uh,
Yes, exactly.
and I really wish the secular, and again, you have to realize that secular people, especially if they're not saved, they're not going to act like saved people. They're not going to talk
Right.
like saved
Yeah.
people. But I really wish they would learn, okay, entertainment does not equal filth. you know?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah.
But there probably are a lot of people out there that they like it before the filth. I can't imagine it, but there's a lot of people out there that like that. So
Well, I remember recommending a book. It was a secular book, but it was really had a lot of really good things to say. But she used the F word,
yes.
4 or 5 times. And so I remember saying to someone, "I just want you to know that's going to happen. Just step over that, um, and get to the meat of what she's saying." And a reader came up to me afterwards and said, you can do that if you're reading, but if you're listening to an audiobook, you cannot step over those
No.
discomforting words. And I
No.
hadn't
Yeah.
thought about that, but yeah, because it just blasts you,
Yeah.
and then you're out of the story. So
Yeah, and I
yeah,
think as Christians, we're because of the Holy Spirit that dwells in us, I think we're probably even a lot more sensitive to it than a
yeah, yeah,
non-Christian reader would be. But in one of the reviews, in a review on one of the books I wrote, one of the reviewers commented that the book had a profanity in it, and I do not have any profanity in my books, and it
yeah,
broke my heart. Like it literally broke my spirit because I'm like,
yeah.
I don't want other readers thinking that my
That
Christian
you
fiction
had that, yeah,
books have profanity in them. But I think I realized I read through the book. I was like, I couldn't imagine what the reader read.
Yeah.
Because, sometimes, and I'm very careful about even putting slang in my books, because as a kid, we were never allowed to use slang. My parents were
Yeah.
like, well, if you're going to say that word, you may as well just say the real word, because it's the same
Yeah.
thing. It's a replacement
Yeah.
for the real word. Slang is just not even something I even routinely use in my normal talking. So anyway, so I kind of flipped through my book, and a friend of mine, she was like, well, there was one part in there where the character had said something, and it was kind of a political fiction type book. And
Mm.
one of the characters had made the comment that the world was going to hell in a handbasket. Well,
Oh,
in that context, that was
yeah.
not a profanity, so
No.
you kind of have to understand context. But so anyway, but I learned from that. So now I'm like, okay, I'm not even going to put anything in there like that where anyone
Yeah.
could even, because I just don't
Yeah.
want to be associated with that kind of filthiness.
Right.
So
Right.
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly.
You've been writing for a long time. Can you narrow down your career? As you write, you sort of learn new things. You learn things that you don't want to do. You learn how to tighten up your writing style. Can you narrow down your writing career to maybe something you've learned along the way that maybe you didn't know in the beginning, but you kind of know now?
Yes, and what comes to mind is I had written probably 4 or 5 novels, historical novels, when my editor at Multnomah then, and his name is Rod Morris, a wonderful editor. All my editors have been wonderful. I have to say, I'm so fortunate.
Yeah,
And
a
he
good editor
recommended.
is worth their weight in gold.
Oh, absolutely. And I think especially if you are if you're self-publishing, to have, be willing to invest in a
Yes,
good editor, because it's really pays off.
it really does.
Anyway, he recommended a book called Structuring Your Novel
Hmm.
by Fitzgerald and Roberts are the two authors. And it was published in the 70s. It's still in print.
Uh-huh.
And it looked at 4 From Here to Eternity, Madame Bovary. I forget what the other 2, but 4 novels that these authors you went over to identify what made them great versus just a mediocre.
Oh,
Why do people still read them? And that was very useful. But what was even more useful for me and has become a practice now is that before I start writing, they had these 3 questions, and they said, answer these 3 questions. And so and the 3 questions were, the first one is, what is my intention? And it's kind
hmm,
of the elevator question, like you get on the elevator and somebody says, what are you working on? And you've got a one-liner before you
yeah,
get to the next floor.
yeah,
Um, and the second question was, what is my attitude towards this story? And the corollary to that is like, what do I feel deeply about?
hmm,
Why has this story grabbed me and won't let me go? And then the third one is, what is my purpose in writing this story? And the corollary to that is kind of a double one. One is like, I'm trying to prove that, that if that empathy is a value that will help you through your life or something, whatever. But the other is, how do I hope a reader will be changed? If this is my purpose, how do I hope a reader will, what do I hope a reader is going to walk away with in this book? Because that's what fiction is about, is moving
yeah,
us, changing
absolutely.
us. And so I will maybe take many pages in answering those questions before I start writing.
Hmm.
And I try to get it down to 1 sentence each. And then in very tiny type, I take those 3 sentences and I stick them at the top of my computer. And then I start to work. I have my timeline. I have all these other sorts of things that I've done to help me get going. But in the middle, I call it the muddle in the middle. It's like, why? That's when the voices, those harpies, start talking. This is a stupid idea. What a dumb book, and all that sort of stuff. I
Yes.
can look up at those 3 sentences and say, this is what this book is about. This is what I feel deeply about. And this is why I hope a reader will get out of this book. And it helps me stay focused and silence those little voices. But it also helps me, like when I get off on some tangent, like, I wonder what color was available to Crayola in 1903 or something,
Yeah.
and I could spend hours looking for various things and going off in directions. I can go back up there and look at that. If this is not going to help tell this story, then I
Yeah.
have to let it go.
Yeah.
And another thing I've learned is to make notes in my little margins and say, look this up later, because
Yeah.
otherwise I might just get diverted and not finish where I am, lose
Yeah.
that strain,
Yeah,
the
you can
passion.
literally go down a rabbit trail of research, and before you know it, your whole day's gone. You're like, I didn't accomplish a thing.
That was so helpful for me, and it has, um, with each of the books, it's been my go-to practice to
Hmm.
help me. And it doesn't mean that when I finish that draft that necessarily I'm where I was when I started, but it
Yeah.
kept me going to the finish line, so
Yeah.
that I can, stay focused enough to do the work.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
at the end of the day, you need to be able to see that finish line. Otherwise, you're never
Yeah.
going to get it done. Yeah.
Yes. You have to
Yeah.
stay in the room and do it.
You
Yeah.
do. Yeah. It
Yeah.
takes some self-discipline. It really does.
It does.
Yeah.
It does.
But for
Yeah.
me, it really does. I mean, it does, but like I enjoy the process of writing so much that like I don't sometimes I have to force myself to get out of that world and join the real world. Do you
Yes,
ever
there's
get
that.
there? Yeah.
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 So,
I remember my husband used to cook, and he called me one time I was in my office working. He said, okay, dinner's on. And I said, okay, let me just finish this paragraph. And that's all I did. I worked on that paragraph and I went downstairs and there was nothing there. And I said, I thought you said dinner was ready. And he said, that was 2 hours ago.
oh my word.
And I totally was so engaged in that paragraph that I lost all sense of time. And that's an incredible gift for us as writers,
Oh yeah.
both that we can get lost, and also that there are support systems out there who would still be willing to cook again tomorrow.
Exactly.
I left him.
They're in that zone. I'm just going to let them have it.
Yeah,
And when they come out, we'll take over.
exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Well, I want to transition into the book, but I have to say, I'm sitting here looking at a picture of you, and you've got a handsome little fella in the picture with you.
Yeah.
Tell us about Rupert.
Rupert is a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel. And we got him at a kennel. It was called Storybrooke Cavaliers. So, I mean, obviously connected to writers. And there were two dogs in the same litter that looked very much alike. And the breeder always liked that the name would be related to a story of some kind. And Rupert is a name that our pastor actually was giving a sermon, and he talked about his friend named Rupert. And I remember leaning over to my husband and said, that'd be a great name for a dog.
That is a great name
And
for a dog.
and there was a character in the British, and Cavaliers are British, that was called Rupert the Bear. And so it's a children's series. So we decided to name the dog Rupert. But we had actually picked the other dog, and everything was signed. And I went to get that dog in the morning, and the breeder had changed her mind. And she said, no, because she shows dogs, and she said, the left side, which is the side the judges see, is more interesting for this other dog, who she named James Harriet,
Ah.
from All Creatures Great and Small. So
Yeah.
James Harriet was almost ours, but he's gone on to win awards, grand champion or whatever. And we have the delight of having Rupert, who is much more, I think he's very, I call him a benign narcissist, because he loves attention. He's a wonderful dog. He's actually sleeping behind me right now as I'm going through this.
Oh,
He's quickly learned that when I'm at the computer, he just has to sleep until I'm
yeah.
done.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's been a joy.
Oh,
We had another Cavalier for like 13 years. And before that, we've always had big dogs, hunting dogs, bird dogs. That my husband was a bird hunter, and
yeah.
so he gives us a lot of joy. He has a column occasionally in my newsletter, My Story
Oh.
Sparks newsletter. Yes. So
Oh,
people
okay.
get to meet him. Yeah.
Oh, fine. Well, he is adorable. I'll flash a picture on the screen for the people that are watching instead of listening. But yeah, he is adorable. When I saw that, I was like, oh my goodness, he is so cute.
Yeah, he's a
So
sweetheart.
let's move into the book. I believe this book is releases on May the 20th.
It
It's
does.
called
Yeah.
Across the Crying Sands. It's a story based on the life of Mary. Okay, is it Gerritse?
Goretzky. Yeah, Goretz.
Ger, Gerritse.
Goretzky. Yep.
Gerritse. Okay. She was the first female carrier on the rugged Oregon coast in the 1890s, as well as her rather unconventional yet inspiring life. It's the first of a trilogy titled The Women of Cannon Beach, which is about strong women and the men in their lives, and it's set on an isolated section of the North Oregon coast. So you'll have to forgive me for not knowing this. Is this the first book in the series, or is this the
Yes,
third?
it is. It's the
This
first
okay, so
book.
there's going to be
First
more
book. Yep.
coming.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, I'll say it was a phenomenal book. I
Oh,
so
thank you.
enjoyed reading it. So, and I didn't realize until after I had read the book that it's actually based on an actual person in history. So I thought before we get started, we might tell the listeners a little bit about her. So I've got a little bio here on her. Do you want me to read it, or do you want to
Sure.
tell
No, you
based
go
on
ahead.
your
Yeah.
research? Okay.
Yeah, go
Okay.
ahead.
Okay, so Gerritse, I got this off of a historical page on something I found online, so hopefully it's accurate. So Gerritse, it says Gerritse would not have thought of herself as an intrepid or courageous woman. She was a woman who did what needed to be done. She was fond of traveling and going where most women were not expected or were not even allowed to go, and she ruffled a few feathers along the way, which totally makes me love her. Um, she enjoyed quiet moments by herself, with the wind rustling her hair, with her horse Prince by her side, and Prince is included in your novel.
Right.
She plunged into the wilds of the Oregon rainforest, braving northwest squalls, changing tides, and narrow cliffs, hugging trails to deliver the mail from 1897 until 1902. They talk about her here, where she once delivered the mail. She came upon several men on a trail she frequented. They waved at her, yelled, and told her not to come onto the trail because it was narrow, because on the other side there was like a 400-foot drop into the ocean. And you actually write about that scene in your
Yes.
book.
Yes.
And she just plowed on ahead, and she wrote in her journal, there was one man who, like, when she plowed ahead, he tried to climb up the opposite side of the cliff to get out of her way because it scared him so much. And she wrote in her journal, I felt sorry for him. The other side of the trail went down 400 feet to the ocean, but I didn't know enough to be afraid. There was also a funny thing about her. She refused to ride side saddle, which was customary for women of that day. She said, when I carried the mail, I rode astride on a saddle. I got a lot of criticism because it wasn't ladylike, but what's the difference, because I wasn't doing a lady's work anyway. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I just,
Yeah.
does any of that kind of jive with your research on
It
her?
all rings true. Yeah.
Yeah, she sounded like an extraordinary woman.
Yeah. So, a biography, and you were reading, a biography tells what someone did and when they did it. But
Mhm.
fiction allows us to explore why they might have done it and what they might have felt when they
Yes.
were doing it. And so that all rings true about Mary. And as I began doing the research about her, there were some additional things that she did a lot of interviews that are available at the Historical Society, and someone even did a film. They had an actress who read her
Mm.
journal and acted out a lot of
Oh.
her essay, her commentary in the interviews. But one of the things I discovered is that she and John, they were married for many years, but they had 4 children really quickly after they were married. She was 16 when they were married, and her father had to actually give permission for her to get married. And that's one of the mysteries of the story, is that when he signed it as Minnie and not
Yeah.
Mary.
Oh,
And
okay.
so the reader's going to have to keep reading to get that to have some meaning for them. But
Uh-huh.
um, but they had 4 children really quickly. And it was a very hard way to make a living on the Oregon coast. As you note, the weather, the area was isolated because there weren't any roads, because the inland was so thick with, timber and brambles and trees. And so the main highways were the beaches.
Yeah.
And whether you went on that highway was dependent on the tides and whether or not you could read the tides. And you might have to wait until the
Mm-hmm.
tide went out again. Um, so, one of the things that I found really intriguing is that they had 4 children at home when she began carrying the mail. And I wondered how that decision came about, because they ended up hiring a nanny or a child tenderer to look after the children. Often John had to be gone. He had a job
Mm-hmm.
where he was gone for 3 months at a time. She was there alone with those kids. Her parents didn't live too far away, but then eventually they moved. And so some of that family backup wasn't there. And so that was, for me, a really big part of the story, of this sort of public persona of Mary as tough, and
Yeah.
I didn't know enough to be afraid, and, I
Yeah.
can handle this. And at the same time, there she is with 4 children and being overwhelmed by family. So that's part of the balance of the story for me, and of the storyline. And I think that happened, with all the other women that I've written about, that balance between your own being and your own creativity and your own sense of who I am, and
Mm-hmm.
also being the parent, the wife, the sister, the friend, and all those roles that we have, finding a balance to them to lead the life that you feel that God is calling you to leave, is part
Yeah.
of the journey of almost all of the stories I write about. Yeah.
Yeah. A big part of the story is, Mary had this huge yearning, especially back in that day. The women were it was more expectant of them to be the homemaker, to stay home and take
Hmm.
care of the kids. Well, she had this huge yearning. She didn't want to stay home. She wanted to have a job. And so, like, in your research in writing about women from those earlier periods, do you find that most women were content to sort of to play in that role of homemaker, wife, mother, or did a lot of them sort of have that yearning to live a life of adventure and to have jobs? Do you have a sense of that?
I think they all had a yearning, but it may not have been for adventure. One of the books I wrote was about a woman named Molly Ronan. It's called Beneath the Bending Skies, and she was a Montana woman. And her passion was to be a wife and mother and have kids.
Yeah,
And she fell in love with a man that her father disapproved of,
yeah,
and he wanted her to get an education, so she went to school, she became a teacher. There were things she didn't want to do. She wanted to just be a wife and mom, and
yeah.
eventually she had the courage to stand up to her father, and marry this man that she'd been in love with for many years. and
Hmm.
and it's a wonderful story of her finding her place in life. But there's the poet Rainer Maria Rilke. I don't know if he wrote in the 1800s, but he said that when we're born, God calls us by name and sends us out into the universe
Yeah,
and walks beside us. And we don't remember that, but we remember this voice saying, "You, sent out beyond your recall, go to the limits of your longing." And so
yes,
I think it is a universal um, desire that we have. C.S. Lewis called it, he had a German word called Sehnsucht. It's like this compulsion to find who we are as, as people of God, to find where we belong, to find what our passion is.
hmm,
And for many of these women, it was expected that that passion would be as a wife and mother. But
yeah,
a great many of them, and I think that's probably why I'm drawn to their stories, is that they wanted something else. They wanted
yeah.
something in addition. And whether it was women's suffrage or whether it was to become a doctor, And the way in which they, pursued those passions has always been intriguing to me. And I think women of today, that if I do a good job with telling these historical stories, that they can bring something to women of today, men and women, about how to pursue those passions and be true to yourself, as well as
Mm-hmm.
meet the expectations you have about being a good mom or being a wife or not being married at all and having a journey that
Yeah.
matters. So
Yeah. Yeah, and I thought you did a real good job of depicting her in the book, of kind of sort of achieving that balance of
I
being the
hope so.
homemaker, being the wife, but also, and like in the book, he was very supportive. There were times he didn't, I don't think he really wanted her delivering the mail, because at that time it
Yeah.
was a very treacherous job. It wasn't
Yeah,
like
it
just
was.
driving around in a truck today. So I can understand as a husband why he would be, really not want his wife doing that. Plus, you also had the stigma of, your wife works for a living. What's wrong with your
Exactly.
family? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
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 So I thought that was a very enjoyable aspect of the book, sort of watching that tug of war within
Yes,
their
for
family
him as
dynamic
well. Yeah.
for him as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So talk to us a little bit about, the book is called Across the Crying Sands. Tell us about the Crying Sands. I had never heard that term before.
Well, some of your listeners and viewers might be familiar with Cannon Beach in Oregon. There's actually a very large Christian retreat center there that has been there
Oh.
for a number of years. But it's got this iconic rock, Haystack Rock, which is on the cover, and
Oh,
I
okay.
love that. And it's a very flat piece of beach, and it was isolated. It was like 7.5 miles, a gorgeous beach, but to get to it was just treacherous and so it didn't get developed until much later. But it was the Nehalem and Clatsop people lived on that beach, and there was a tsunami in the late 1700s. That and when a tsunami happens, the tide goes way out,
Yeah.
and the native women went out, followed that out, because here was new tide land to be able to dig for clams and mussels
Oh,
and
they
so
didn't
on.
realize what was
And
coming.
they didn't realize what was coming. And when it came, many, many of them died. And so if you walk on that beach, and people have commented about this, they even call it the crying sands. Native people do, because when you walk on that sand, it has a little squeaky sound to it, a different sound the sand does.
Mm.
And people say it sounds like someone um, crying, or it sounds like someone it's just different. and
Yeah.
and so it stands out, and that's where the title came from, is that's the
Okay.
native referred to it as the crying sands, and
Yeah.
in remembrance of all these women who died, and many, the tribe was decimated, with those people who had lived there once. So yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And you do have a little prologue that sort of deals with, that kind of starts during that time period. There's something about a
right.
cannon. And is
Yes.
that true as well?
Yes, the story of how it got its name is true. And there were just other little interesting things, like there were shipwrecks that,
Yes.
and things would get blown up and washed up onto the beach during high tides. And one of the ships came from the Philippines, we think, and it had in the as ballast beeswax, big chunks of beeswax, which they
Yes.
used as ballast, but also because the early Catholic Church wanted the candles in the monasteries along the California, that whole area. They wanted those candles to be made with beeswax and not the smelly tallow of elk or deer.
Yeah.
And so it was included in the ships, but people, even as well as into the 1950s, would still occasionally, there'd be these big chunks of beeswax that would show up, and Mary and her father picked up a big chunk that then they
They
sold,
did.
and it was a
Yeah.
way of making money on the Oregon coast. So yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
just interesting little things. Yeah.
So much interesting stuff interwoven throughout the story. Yeah, it was so interesting because I had never heard of any of that. So, how
Yeah.
did Mary? You'll have to forget Gerritse, Gerritse,
Geretsky. Yeah.
Gerritse.
Yeah.
how did she come on your radar as someone that you wanted to write about?
So about 13 years ago, I was at a book signing at the Lilac Gardens. It's actually the book that won the Carroll Award. I was signing books, and this woman had driven several hours from the Oregon coast to Washington, and she brought me a copy of a book about the history of Cannon Beach. And she said, I think this story about Mary should be your next book.
Mm.
And that was 13 years ago. And I said, well, if that story calls my name, I know I'd learn something that I otherwise wouldn't learn, but maybe you should write that story because you
Yeah.
really are caring about it. No, she said, I'm not a writer. She's a teacher. And so through the years, she was a wonderful researcher. She lived in Seaside, which is near Cannon Beach. And she would send me things, and she sent me tickets of a tour of the cottages of the Cannon Beach, and postcards, and just we began this relationship. She fell in love. She got married. Her name was Susie Johnson at the time, and
Okay.
then we just stayed connected. And then um, about 3 years ago, I actually thought, well, maybe I'm ready to retire. And I've written my last book, and my husband's health had deteriorated, and we sold our home to get to more manageable property, and moved to Redmond, a smaller community. And but my publisher at Revell, Andrea Doring, had she stayed in touch and said, when you get ready, maybe there might be another book there. And so I thought, well, maybe I could make this into a 3-book series and
Yeah.
talk about other women in the Oregon Beach, Oregon too. So anyway, I ended up pitching that story, and with Susie's help, with research, because I wasn't able to travel as much. So I really feel like the book wouldn't have happened without Susie. So it was a reader impetus that got Mary on my radar. And of course, once I spent more time with Mary, I fell in love with her too. So
Yeah. You're like,
hopefully readers will as well.
oh, well, I certainly did. I'm kind of bad about when I read the beginnings of books. Sometimes stuff doesn't stick with me. It takes a while to get into the story. And so you may have mentioned that earlier in the book that she was a real person,
No,
but it
it's at
just
the end. It's at
okay.
the end. Yeah, I do the
Okay.
author's notes, and my readers who followed me. Originally, I put it in the beginning, but now I just get into the story and I put that at the end. But some readers say to me, I always read that first, so I know, what part of this is real and which characters were real, and
Yeah.
which ones weren't, and so on. But yeah,
Oh,
but
okay.
I mean, I'm delighted that you enjoyed the story, even
Oh, so
without
much.
realizing that it was about a real person. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. It really appealed to me, and I look forward to the rest of them. So there
Good.
was one of the characters in the book was a Herbert. He was a remittance man. Never heard
Yes.
of that. Tell us a little bit about that. Tell readers what, in case anyone doesn't know what that is.
So a number of the early residents along the North Oregon coast, and up into British Columbia actually, were Britishers, and they were usually the second sons. They couldn't inherit, and so their families would try to get rid of them,
Hmm.
so that the older brother could carry on with his life, and they would get rid of them, and they often came to the New World, and they would get a remittance every month, so much money, and
Hmm.
that was sort of to help keep them out of the hair of the brother, the heir apparent.
Yeah,
And so there were a number of remittance men who lived on the coast, and Herbie, was a friend of Mary and John, and he was sort of an entrepreneur, and he had it in his mind that if people could get to the beach, it would be a great tourist spot, which of course it is today, a huge tourist
yeah,
draw. And so part of his story is finding his way as well. And there's some side stories of you know caring deeply about the woman who eventually became his brother's
yes,
fiance. So, but
yeah,
meanwhile, he's working at doing the work to get a real road so that people could come from Portland, which was the largest big city, and not have a 7 to 8 hour trip to get to the beach to fish or hunt or and
Yeah.
it's a beautiful beach, and the waves are soft there, and so that's a great sunbathing beach, and fly kites and build sandcastles,
Oh.
and the Elk River runs there, and Herbert built a hotel on the Elk River and really hoped that maybe that hotel would become the post office.
Hmm.
So that was part of another
Yeah.
competition, and
Yeah.
then getting money for the road and all of that, all of the trials. But
Yeah.
yeah, he was a fun person to discover really existed,
Uh-huh.
and how he made his life there. So
Yeah, and I really enjoy reading books where you see people sort of, whether it's contemporary or history, where they sort of are building up their life to what they want it to
yeah.
be. And this was such a fun part of that. Now, did it ever become a tourist attraction during their lifetime, or did that come after his lifetime?
No, it did start to become that way, because
Did
once
it?
the road was created, even though it had 111 turns in this
What?
7 mile stretch, um, that did open things up. And in the second book, one of the things I discovered in doing the research is that they had what they called daddy trains,
Uh-huh.
and they were a train that would leave on Saturday morning from Portland to the coast, and bring the men who would, be working, and often the wife and the children were at the coast, and they would spend the summer there at Cannon Beach,
Hmm.
and then on Saturday, the dad on the daddy train would come and spend the weekend, and then he'd go back on Monday morning. So, and I just thought
Uh,
how at that time, that's how the community and the culture adapted. Oh,
mhm.
these people want to spend time at the coast, and they were little cottages that were built there, and often they would rent out tents in the backyard, and that's how they sort of made a little money when people came. But yes, to this day, I mean, if you want to stay in Cannon Beach, you better make reservations at, the Christmas before or
Really?
earlier. Yeah,
It's
it's
that big
very,
of an
very,
attraction.
yes, very
Now
big
I don't know
attraction.
if you know the answer to this or not, but like, did any of the buildings that they built during that time, have they survived? Like, are they still there?
Yes, actually, some of the early cottages that were built,
Okay.
and in the third book, readers will discover that John and Mary build a boarding house in Cannon
Oh,
Beach,
okay.
and that still is there. I think it's the Birkenstock store now,
Oh,
but
really?
it was you can walk down the street and go, that was their house, that was their boarding house.
Wow,
Yeah,
that's amazing.
yeah.
So you can actually go and see buildings that Mary saw.
Yes. And
Yeah.
that was one of the things that I've enjoyed about writing so many of the stories, is that they are places that people can visit. And I had a lot of homeschoolers tell me that they've read my books, and then they make a trek. They come out with their kids and they do a tour
Hmm.
around, Oregon or Washington, to visit those places that I write about back in the
Yeah. Oh
1800s, and
gosh, that's gotta
see.
feel
Yeah.
good. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a delight. Yeah.
Have you had the opportunity to go there to Cannon
Oh
Beach?
yes.
You have?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, 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 several times. Yeah, and one of the things when I was still debating about whether to write this story is the day after, I think it's New Year's, there's a dog show, the National Dog Show after the Rose Parade.
Uh-huh.
And so I was watching, because I always watch the National Dog Show, and they were celebrating something. And so the two hosts were giving each other gifts. And one of the gifts was a painting that the host had done for his co host, who had a Cavalier. And it was from a photograph that was taken at Cannon Beach. And so there I was watching, and he gave him this wonderful painting of he and his little Cavalier with Haystack Rock in the background. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is some guy in, New York, who came out to visit Cannon Beach with his little dog. And of course, I had Rupert. So it was like, oh, I think this is a sign I'm supposed to write this book.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm so
Yeah.
glad you did. Yeah, and I imagine
Thanks.
it's just going to get even better as it progresses.
Well, I hope
Uh,
so. I hope
yeah,
so. Yeah.
one thing that the story delved in, and for the readers listening, we're not going to give any spoilers. The story kind of delved into like the dynamics of Mary, the origins of Mary's family. Can you
Yes.
tell us a little bit about that?
Mary, I think I mentioned earlier that when her dad signed permission for her to get married, he put down Minnie,
Hmm.
and she questioned that. I mean, that's a fact that he used the term Minnie. Whether or
Hmm.
not she questioned it is fictional,
Do we know why
but
he did that?
you will find out later,
Oh, okay. Okay.
because we believe that that was actually her original name, and
Oh,
that the
okay.
family changed the name. And these are things, this is the speculation, okay?
And
So
if you
we
don't want to
know
go
that,
into it on this podcast, you don't have to.
no, I won't go into great detail, but what
Okay.
these are things we know that were clues to my belief that Mary struggled with where she began.
Hmm.
And so we know she was born in New York, but they didn't stay in New York. They went to Minnesota. And then we know they didn't stay in Minnesota, and they came to Oregon. And then we know they didn't stay in the Willamette Valley of Oregon very long before they went to the coast. And then there was no farther they could go because they would be in the ocean. And
Hmm.
so we know there was some evidence that her parents were avoiding something. And it is our speculation, and then later, of course, it does get confirmed that Mary was struggling with who she belonged to. Where did she come from? Were these adoptive parents, or were they her biological parents? And part of the storyline for her mother is her mother made some decisions, and they didn't share with Mary what had gone on. And so that becomes part of Mary's struggle in addition to other things, and also her parents' struggle. So that's part of the storyline, which is woven through, and in the third book will get totally resolved. So
Oh, so fascinating. I can't wait. You've really whetted my appetite. I went online and like sort of, started looking things up on her, but I really didn't find a whole lot online. So,
yeah, well, that's
do
nice.
you do you find that it's are you having a difficult time finding things to sort of how are you finding stuff on her that you
So
want to?
there isn't a lot online, but like the Nehalem County Historical Society, the Clatsop County Historical Society, the
Okay.
Seaside. So, and those are again documents that you have to go there. They're not online, and so
Yes.
you have to go there, get copies, read them, or whatever. And actually, my very first use of AI, or at least that I think it was my first use, who knows, was I took one of those interviews that had gotten copied, and so I could put them online to read them, and I put them into an AI program so that I
Oh,
could search it. And it was really interesting to do that. I put in the question, what would a a female postal carrier of the 1890s wear? And
yes.
so using that, AI came up with, and I had everything in there except the one thing that that the AI came up with was that they would have carried a little leather belt that would have had a little packet about, might have carried her knife in that, or, some other
Yeah.
things to get, a hoof scraper to get rocks out of her horse's hoof or something. So,
Yeah.
but ultimately the research is really, going to those places and
Yeah.
getting copies, and reading them, and then, hopefully creating from little bits and pieces, census records, landowner records, homesteading records, and like who were their neighbors. That's something you can find in the census records.
Yeah.
It's like, well, who was their neighbor? And that might have something to share, or discovering that her teacher was in fact the justice of the peace, and the justice of the peace is who married them, because the minister was a traveling minister and got there too late. So,
Oh.
or that the wedding was at 7, like in the morning, on a, they did it on the day of the week so that they waited to have the party after Sunday. So they got married on Saturday, but no party until actually Monday. So,
Oh.
because they didn't want to have dancing in that would end up on Sunday. So they
Ah,
wanted to respect Sunday as a day of the Sabbath. So, yeah,
yes.
so just little things like that, which tell you about their character and who they were, and
Yeah.
what faith meant to them,
Yeah.
and how
So they
that
were
worked.
people
So
of strong faith.
they were, yeah.
Yeah.
And at that time, you didn't have you usually use the school was also the church and the community gathering place and so on. And their pastor was an itinerant pastor until probably, I think about the later 1890s, they actually had a church and a pastor who was assigned, but they would also go to other little towns and travel by canoe up the rivers and, to meet their parishioners. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Now, one thing I read about her, and if I'm going into any territory that you don't really want to reveal because it's going to be in another book, just let me know and we can edit it out. But one thing I read about her was that I think at one point when she was on the mail route, she used to wear men's clothes. Or at
Hmm.
least trousers, which was uncommon for women
Right.
in that day. And
Yeah.
she got such pushback from the offended people of her day that she was dressing like that she would actually wear men's clothes under a dress. Is that true?
The first pantsuits. Yeah,
Okay.
so she would, yeah. But there was also a fashion, and this happened usually about early 1900s. So it would have been she would have been already delivering mail for a couple of years. But by
Hmm.
the 1900s, someone had designed a split skirt, and that would have
Oh.
like a flap down the front. And
Uh-huh.
so she could still ride astride, but as soon as you got off the horse, you had this panel that came down in front of you that made it look like you were wearing a skirt. And
Oh,
that,
okay.
for some reason, and we know that that was the case. Another book that I wrote about a woman called The Healing of Natalie Curtis, she was also riding astride, but she'd been an Eastern woman and she had access to this panel so that people didn't get their sensibilities offended because a
Yeah.
woman wore pants. But the other thing I discovered in doing research is that often, when a woman during that time, if her husband was killed and she was a widow, that 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 the women would wear their husband's clothes for as long as they could
Oh.
to keep the scent of him
Oh,
close,
okay.
as
Yeah.
a part of a grieving process. So
Yeah.
I think when women did that, people were like, oh, okay, she's just grieving. But for Mary to do it when John was alive and well, that was like, well, what's wrong with her? So
Yeah.
yeah, that was
Yeah.
it was just one of the things she had to deal with and I'm sure she would have gotten pushback about, well, you've got kids at home, what are you doing?
Yeah.
So there would have been that. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
What are you doing out doing this when you've got kids at home? Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
So
but they had their own sets of challenges. When in my mind, I think I sort of kind of romanticize historical times because our world is so fast and so chaotic and just
yeah.
so, that sometimes I feel like the simpler times are just would be better times, but they really did have their own sets of
Yeah.
difficult times
Yeah.
to navigate through. Yeah.
I spoke in an event a number of years ago, a historical society, and a man and his wife had come, and they were signing books, and when he got to brought his book to be signed, he said, this was my birthday present. My wife said, what do you want to do for your birthday? And he said, I want to go hear this author and talk to her, because he said, you've given me a community. I always
Hmm.
felt like I was born 100 years too late, and that these are the kinds of people I wanted to interact with. And that,
Yeah.
the way I feel about my wife or the way I feel about my family, that there were other people who felt like that. And he said, I really appreciate that you've given me a community. And I just thought that was one of the nicest compliments I could have had for the story, for how a reader was changed. That would be an answer, that they
Yeah.
would feel like they were connected and belonged. Yeah.
Yeah, as an
So
author, there is no better compliment than when a reader tells you how much your work impacted their life in some
yeah,
way. Yeah,
exactly.
that's just what
Exactly.
it's all
Yeah.
about. Is there anything about the book that you felt was especially challenging in sort of putting out the life of Mary?
I think for me, this series, the thing that has been challenging is that I always had the option with the other books to go there. I call that go there,
Yeah,
and to actually, and I really didn't. Once I made the decision to write Mary's story, I really only had one visit that I could work out because of my husband's health, um, and and so I always felt like I'd never lived on the coast. I never had, so I had to draw a lot on when we vacationed at the coast, or an earlier book that I wrote that was set on the southern Oregon coast. But the challenge was, have I created a world that people living on the coast today will accept
yeah,
as authentic,
yeah,
and that I haven't messed up somehow with, well, no, they couldn't possibly have, fished that kind of fish in January
yes,
or whatever, that sort of thing. And that's where, loved ones who live on the coast would get calls from me saying, okay, what can you see today? What can you smell? What can you hear?
yeah,
Or Susie, who was my, confidant through this whole journey, I remember, I sent her a section to read and see if it rang true. And she got right back to me and she said, "You're so right about umbrellas, because people don't use umbrellas on the coast. You'd think with all that rain, but
yeah.
nobody has an umbrella. You have a slicker or something because the wind is so terrible." And so she
Oh.
said, "You captured that." She said, "If you'd have said, 'Oh, yeah, they're walking on the beach with an umbrella,' she said, 'we would know they were tourists.'"
Uh,
So,
so how did you
so
figure that out? Just through research?
I just remember, I just sort of imagined walking in there. I thought,
Oh, okay.
no, they're probably not going to have an umbrella because the wind would be too
Yeah.
crazy, So,
Yeah.
but
Sort of a
that,
common sense conclusion.
yeah, but
Yeah.
that was the challenge. It was to create a world, a landscape that people could step into and feel. If you'd never been there, that you would feel like, oh, I know where this is. And if you
Yeah.
live there, that you would say, okay, she got it.
Yes.
So that's been the challenge.
Yeah,
So
and that is the challenge, especially when you're writing about a place that's an actual place where people actually live there. You always
yeah,
run the risk, no matter how well you research. No, you're always going to get somebody that says, "Well,"
yes, yeah, exactly. So I'm fully prepared, but yeah. So we'll see how it all comes about.
we'll go ahead and start wrapping this up. Is there anything else you kind of want the readers to know about the book, or that we haven't touched on, or?
No, you've done a fine job. I really appreciate
Oh,
that you had the time to read it and that you did that additional research. I really appreciate that.
before we head off, tell readers where they can find you online if they want to look you up or follow
So
you
I have
or.
a Facebook, an author page on Facebook and Instagram. I do have a Blue Sky, but I don't post very much there. And the best place to find out things is at my website, which is jkbooks.com.
Mhm.
And have the newsletter Story Sparks, which anybody who gets the newsletter is automatically signed up for a big giveaway called Seashore Sorts of Treasures.
Oh,
So that we're putting together to honor the release of the book in May. So I would be delighted to have people just touch base there, or they can read it at the website in the archives as well. So yeah, thank you so much for asking.
yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much for putting Mary into our lives. It was such a pleasure to read about her in the first book. We appreciate you coming on the podcast. Do you have any final words before we sign out of here?
No, just I'm just grateful for the podcast, and I hope that your listeners and viewers take away some insight for their own writing and for the importance of stories in their lives.
Absolutely. I hope so too. All right. Well, Jane, thank you for coming on. We appreciate you so much for taking the time to do this. And readers, we will be back with you next week with another I can't even remember who it is who we're talking to next week, but so you'll just have to come back and find out. So we'll talk to all you guys later. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us on the Bookish Introverts podcast, where together we explore the worlds within the pages. Until next time, stay bookish.